There we go. So our next presenter is John McLevey from University of Waterloo. John's going to present joint work with Pierson, Browne and Tyler Crick, and focused on reproducibility and principled data processing in Python. So thank you very much, John.
Thanks. Are you able to see my slides okay there?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay, great. I'm teaching remotely, but asynchronously, so I'm never really sure yet. I haven't had much time to figure this out. Yes, hi, I'm John McLevey. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. So I think we have the distinction of being the campus in Ontario with the least amount of partying. And our joke is not that everybody is in their dorms smoking pot, it's that they're in their dorms doing math because we're the University of Waterloo. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here and be involved in this workshop. I've learned much from everything so far. Thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation. And hopefully next year we'll be able to do this together in person. The talk that I want to give today is a little different than the kind of talk that I usually give in a variety of ways. The most important is that it's unapologetically practical. This is a session on practices, after all. So for obvious reasons, I'm not going to spend any time really explaining why reproducibility and transparency in research is important, which unfortunately is something that I usually would have to do a fair bit of motivation for in my field. I'm going to safely assume that you agree that those things are worth doing. And instead, I'm going to focus on two things. I'm going to give a fairly high-level overview of a specific approach to doing reproducible scientific research and statistical computing that I think you know, despite not being very widely known, is incredibly effective. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a tool, an in-house tool that my lab developed in order to make this process kind of as painless as possible. So I've appended this well sort of to the title of my talk here. And the reason was because you know, I kind of mostly live in the world of Python these days. And sometimes I have to remind myself that what I'm about to talk about today, or the packages, I should say, the tool that I'm going to talk about a little bit later is not actually specific to Python. You don't have to be working in Python to use it. It's just that that package is written in Python. So, you know, we're using Python behind the scenes in service of more reproducible scientific research. So everything I have to say today is in some sense grounded in this, this chapter that I recently co-authored with two of my PhD students who are also co-authors on this talk, Pierson, Browne, and Tyler Crick. If you're interested, you can send me an email. I'll happily share this chapter with you. It's an open access chapter. So as promised, the motivations for this talk are entirely practical. They're about, you know, what it takes to actually do reproducible and transparent research once you've made the commitment to do so. And so I am one of those people that will admit that I find this to be really hard, much harder than I think you would expect it to be if you haven't had a lot of experience doing collaborative scientific research, which I would imagine pretty much everybody in this workshop has some experience doing. So, you know, you can use lots of really great tools like version control tools like Git, platforms like GitHub and GitLab. You can use virtualization tools like, you know, virtual environments and virtualization tools like Docker that, you know, make it pretty much everything platform independent and let you scale up computing and work on big clusters and all kinds of things. But using those tools doesn't magically make your work, you know, more transparent, reproducible, or auditable. It makes it possible for them to be reproducible, transparent, and auditable, but using those tools is not sufficient to actually get you there. So in order to sort of motivate some of what I want to argue for a little bit later, I'm going to take you backstage behind a real research project that we were involved in my lab a couple of years ago. And I really hope this is a judgment-free zone here. This absolute monstrosity is a graphical representation of the project that we were working on. If you've never had a project that looked anything like this behind the scenes, I'll just say right now, I just simply don't believe you. I think pretty much all of us had. So anyway, we were working on this project Very few people have seen this figure before the chapter came out. And in a shared moment of frustration, my PhD student Pierson created this figure by hand to try to figure out which scripts were producing which intermediate data files, were written by which member of the research lab. And at the time of this project, I think I had 8 students that were working in this lab. And people were responsible for different bits of things that all sort of came together in this big project. And if you take a look at this, the details, I know that many of you probably can't read it very easily, but the specific details really don't matter. The point is that, this overall pipeline that we developed in this project is massively complicated and very vague. So even though each small component of the project was developed very carefully, it was tested rigorously, using things like unit tests. We have a lot of best practices from scientific computing and engineering. But because it's so complicated and vague, you really can't sort of understand this project or this pipeline if you just look at it from this high-level view. Another thing that this exercise revealed to us is that our project directory contained a lot of expired references. So, you have several scripts in here that are processing or reading in data files, for example, intermediate data files in the pipeline that are no longer actually produced by any script that exists in the pipeline, right? Because different pieces of it get edited and moved. And so you end up with these sort of intermediate data sets that were once integrated into the pipeline, but no longer are, but they still exist there. And there's other versions of them with slightly different names. We also discovered that we had some isolated tasks within the larger pipeline, right? So if you can see in the upper right corner, there are several tasks that, for reasons we were never really able to fully understand, make absolutely no contribution to the overall data processing pipeline. They're sort of parallel to the whole structure, but they don't actually hook into anything anymore. And we also discovered some really bizarre circular dependencies. So like in the lower left-hand corner of this, there's a task that produces its own input file. Like, I don't even understand how this came to be, but it did. It just feeds itself, and it doesn't really seem to have any important purpose in the overall data processing pipeline. So at this point, you'd be completely forgiven for thinking that this sort of primordial soup of code and data is the result of carelessness or neglect or incompetence or any of those things. Of course, I'm not going to say that that's the case. I don't think that it is. And like I said, I think pretty much everybody has projects like this that sort of evolve in this ad hoc way over time. Because this is my project, and I know everybody involved and I was involved, I can say that pretty much everything in here was a well-intentioned decision made by a competent person who was more than well equipped to handle what it was that they had taken on, their sort of local piece of this overall project. But nonetheless, the emergent outcome is just pure chaos. And so even though every individual person made decisions that were sensible at the time and were informed by best practices in scientific computing and in engineering, like, again, the use of unit tests, it was just this mess. But the remarkable thing about it is that this pipeline actually produced what it was supposed to produce. If you actually followed this sort of hand-curated step-by-step instructions, basically lists of scripts to execute in a particular order, if you executed it that way, it would actually produce what it was supposed to produce. And yet I don't think anybody could really look at this and say, this is a good example of a well-organized, reproducible, transparent research project. So in that chapter that I mentioned earlier, we have sort of a whole descriptive account of this that goes beyond what I've said here. We sort of describe it in terms of some organizational theories around adhocracy and the types of organizational processes that rely teams to develop a lot of kind of excessively black box code, things that are very locally rational, but globally irrational. So I'm not going to get into a lot of that there, but if you're interested in that kind of more, I guess, analytic account of this and how, even very well organized, highly competent teams can produce ridiculous messes like that, then I would encourage you to check that out. But after, we diagnosed this big problem with this project, and we were sort of all collectively very frustrated around what had happened, we decided that we were basically just never going to do this again. And this wasn't just me, as the PI in the lab saying, you're not going to do this anymore. Like, this is myself and my entire lab just saying this is not a sustainable way to do collaborative research. If you value things like transparency and auditability and all of that. So we have to come to some set of agreement, which is not just an agreement about the specific tools we use, but rather how we go about organizing and executing a project in general. And the framework that we settled on is one called principal data processing, which was first introduced by Patrick Ball, who's the chief scientist of the human rights data analysis group. He's a statistician and a sociologist. And as you could imagine, HRDAG does a lot of enormously important work globally. And our kind of attitude was, this is not a framework that you should just adopt if you're doing like tremendously important work on political killings and so on, like HRDAG is. But really, if you're doing any scientific research that you think is actually important and worthwhile, then these are principles that we should adopt. So in-house, we adopted this experiment that we called going full ball. And basically for one semester, we just kind of immersed ourselves in this workflow. The previous slide, by the way, has a link to a talk that Patrick Ball gave that lays this framework out in more detail than I'm about to. But we adopted this basically for a whole academic semester. We just lived in it. We started developing some in-house tools to make it kind of work a little more effectively for us. And that's essentially the origin of what I'm going to show you now shortly. So this framework is organized around sort of 4 high-level principles, and they're transparency, auditability, reproducibility, and scalability. So the idea is that you want every portion of your project to be easily visible, and you want the role that that part of the project plays to be really easily derived from the name of whatever the portion of that project is. This stuff here, by the way, I know is a little bit abstract. It's going to become much more concrete in a moment. Second would be auditability, right? So you have to have the ability to take a project and to have people that were not involved in creating it basically pick apart its different pieces and understand what all of those pieces do and how they contribute towards some outcome. It has to be reproducible, of course. So, people that have the same data code and software dependencies, the same computing environments can reproduce everything exactly. And it has to be scalable. So, it has to be able to handle both small and large projects, anything that has, multiple kind of inputs or multiple components or purposes, or multiple people involved. The minute anything becomes even remotely complex, this system has to be able to work with it seamlessly. So Ball describes this system as one that's designed to ensure that the structure and the functionality of the system is really, really easily understood by anybody, right? The researchers that are involved in the project over time, we are usually the ones that read most of our own code, right? And yet our own code becomes kind of imperceptible to us after a certain amount of time if it's not handled the right way, but also for external stakeholders. So at a really, really high level, and this is a point that I'm going to make multiple times and showing you examples that sort of make this more concrete. Within the PDP framework, the Principal Data Processing Framework, every project is sort of a root level directory. And then within that, you have a series of subdirectories, and each of those subdirectories represents sort of a coherent unit or task within the project. And that might just be something like, converting data that's in the form of an Excel spreadsheet into a CSV file, or it could be doing some basic data cleaning tasks or something else. So sort of a single individual task, not like a whole chain set of steps. And then within those task directories, you have the same 3 subdirectories again. You would have an input directory, an output directory, and a source code directory. And so for every single one of these tasks, basically, there's some set of inputs that come in from the pipeline. the source code performs some set of operations on them. Maybe it estimates model or something and writes some output into an output file. And then the contents that go into the output file get linked to the inputs of some other task in the pipeline with a symlink. So what you end up with then are these, when you look in your directory, you just sort of see these different subdirectories that have descriptive names to do something. But behind the scenes, the tool that I'm showing you has symlinked all the different file dependencies, so that there's kind of this invisible graph or invisible network behind the scenes that's tracking all of the different file dependencies between these tasks. And that can be used to automatically generate project level documentation, which is a massive aid to understanding what any project base does. So in the framework that Patrick Ball uses, or this sort of environment of tools that Patrick Ball uses, there's a very, very heavy reliance on, like very tried and true open source tools. The most important of those is Make. And I don't know, how many of you in the workshop are familiar with Make. I suspect probably many of you. Make is amazing and it's powerful. It is ancient and it is very frustrating at the same time. It was developed to manage dependencies and compile huge software projects. And so its use in sort of reproducible science is like, this tiny little fraction of functionality that's in Make. And so you can use it to sort of manage your dependencies in a research project effectively. But it's really overwhelming, in particular for students or people that are kind of new to this kind of approach to reproducible computing. Yeah, I see Browne's raising his hand here. And we first started with Make when we adopted Patrick Ball's system. And the main reason for that was because I was the only one in the lab that had kind of any experience using tools like Make before. And it's not that I had a huge amount of expertise, but I was sort of comfortable with the functionality within the context of the scientific research project. And so I insisted that everybody at least try it. And then in short, there was a friendly, not so friendly mutiny because it turns out I'm the only one who had any patience for Make whatsoever. And that really got us thinking a lot about how to use kind of a suite of tools that were more modern, more minimal, and much less sort of intimidating, that would make people that were relatively new to this feel a lot more comfortable adhering to what we consider to be sort of the non-negotiables of doing reproducible and transparent research. And so we ended up relying a lot on sort of the Python ecosystem, which I had kind of moved into out of R maybe about 5 years ago or so. And the big replacement at the heart of all of this stuff was a Python package called doit, which completely replaced Make. So we built this system that I'm going to walk you through here now entirely around this tool instead of things like Make. And this is part of what makes our kind of tooled ecosystem more accessible, but also things like more cross-platform. So the tool is called PDPP, Principal Data Processing with Python. Now, it's a command line tool that's built around Python 3.6 plus. It simplifies adopting a principal data processing workflow in any kind of computational, statistical, quantitative research project. Like if you've got data analysis, collection, cleaning, modeling, that kind of thing. That's what this is designed for. It's based on the idea that, again, that projects are composed of sort of these interlinking steps or tasks that come together in sort of this large, like, project level graph that produces some outcome at the end, whether that's an article or a talk or something else. So because it's a command line tool, it offers nice compatibility with other tools that are widely used in open source computing and research computing, like Git and Docker and virtual environments and stuff like that. So it's also just sort of lives on the command line alongside those other tools. So your Git commands will be all mixed up with your PDPP commands, but they work together really nicely. It's a pretty easy to use tool. It's suitable for non-expert programmers. which I tend to get a fair number in my lab. Like I'll take them in as students and then, train them over a period of years, of course, so they become more expert over time, but they very rarely start as experts. So this enables them to get into projects really quickly and easily. It's cross-platform and cross-language. So, again, we work mostly in Python, but it works equally well if you're working in R or other languages like Julia or something else. So it's easily installed in the same way that any Python package is installed. So you can just pip install it. It's on your system. And then at that point, the process of actually using it is pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through a little bit of what this looks like. So these are just screenshots from terminal. So I hope you can see this okay. I've followed the basic kind of logic here of like creating a project from scratch. So just at the start of this, in the first line here, nothing exists at all. I create a project called demo and I go into it, and you can see that it's completely empty. If you execute this PDPP init command, then it initializes the project with the principal data processing framework. And then so the ls command displays what is created by that init command. You see that there is a Python file that goes in there that is the one that manages all the dependencies. You don't actually have to edit it or do anything to it. And it creates this export and import files. So this is where the any sort of initial imports at the start of a project would go into. So if you had like a pre-trained language model or something, or if you had a public data set, an open data set, you could put it into import, and then that will get propagated through different parts of your pipeline. So as I mentioned, each task in the principal data processing framework is organized identically. So it's a subfolder within the main project directory. It's got a descriptive name, and then inside that directory, there's 3 more directories, and they're always the same for every task: input, output, and SRC for source. So the files that are in the import portion of any task directory are put there automatically. They come from either the main import folder, or from some other task in the chain's output folder. So the inputs and outputs are all linked, right? So you'd have some source code in your source file. So you might do something like read some data, write it to output, and then that output, it becomes a dependency for another task in the chain. So if I create a new task, for example, within PDPP called clean data, I would use this command. I say PDPP new. It's going to ask me what I want to call it, whether it has dependencies from different places. This is all just very easy, kind of hitting spacebar and enter on the command line. It creates this new directory, clean data, as a task. And if you look inside it, it's created the structure that you would want to have in there. It's given it its input file, it's got an output directory, and it's got the source code directory, and it populates it with an empty script that you can work on. So the source code directory is the one where you're actually doing any work. So this is where all your scripts would live. And they're all task specific, right? So they read in the data from input, and they write data and other things into output that can then go into other tasks. So that process of creating the new directory just looks like this. It's PDP new. It's going to ask you want to call it. You type in a name. It populates these lists dynamically to figure out what the dependencies are going to be. Oops, mess up on the slide there. And then you're good to go. So the dependencies for new tasks can come from anywhere. So when you're creating a new part of the project, or a new sort of subdirectory, a new task, it will start by just giving you all the other tasks and say, like, okay, which of the following would house dependencies for this one? And so you can select multiple tasks, right? You might say, well, I'm going to pull in some of the clean data from clean one, and I'm going to pull in these more results from another step. And so you can pull in the dependencies from multiple places, and they'll always be symlinks. They'll always go back to the same proper source. And then the whole reason really for doing all of this is to get to this last final point. So really what we hope is that everything that gets to this point is just as painless and streamlined as possible, right? And then when you have that moment where you sit down and you think like, okay, like what the hell is really going on here? Where am I? What's going on with the project? You would issue this command PDPP graph, ask you for a couple quick customization stuff, and then it automatically generates your project documentation for you. So I'm just going to sort of end by showing you what these look like in a couple of different views. We generate it in 4 different ways that have varying amounts of information. So this one here has the least amount of information. So the project pipeline starts with the import. Import has some files that get imported into clean data. Clean data does some stuff, produces results that go into another step in the pipeline, into you guessed it, and you can sort of follow the flow of dependencies through this project all the way to its very end. You can also ask, or you can also look at a version of this documentation that doesn't just give you the names of the tasks in the project, but also shows you the source code files that are in there. So again, varying amounts of information. You can ask to see the chains of dependencies between all the data files or anything that's in just the inputs and the output files. And of course, you can put all this together into a view that's going to show you, in the boxes, the names of the core tasks, and then inside them, what the source code files are named and what the intermediate data files are as you pass your data along step by step in the pipeline. So I'm going to end it there. As I mentioned, this is intended to be a tool that's used on the command line alongside these other tools like Git and virtual environments that we all use pretty much every day. And I can say it's made my life a lot easier since we adopted it. If you have any questions about it, or you'd like to learn more, I'd be happy to chat now in an email or otherwise. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, John. This is certainly a pain point that I've experienced, and so I'm grateful that you're talking through some tools. Does anyone have any questions or comments for John? Where does just a quick one? Where does the paper live? So like you do some analysis, right? Like you have your code for your inputs, and the source analysis code is all in source, and then there's outputs. And then you write a paper about it, right? And so where does the paper live in this role?
Yeah, so the paper can live in a number of different places. The way that I typically do it is that the paper itself is just another task within the context of the project. And sometimes, like, I was an R person before I was a Python person. And so, things like R Markdown are amazing. There are things like that in the Python ecosystem too. And we want the tool to be agnostic to those, to like, are you an RStudio person or a Jupyter person or a script person or whatever. And so there's nothing built into the tool that's going to look, for example, for like an R Markdown file and knit it. But you could have anything like that. You could have Jupyter notebooks, R Markdown files, or whatever that are tasks in the paper that produce, like, the manuscript or something as a task at the end. We've found in the lab that, there's very often like the type of code that you might have in a paper, like as you're working on it, like in an R Markdown paper, there's like enormous amounts of code that has to get written before you do that, right? And so they might be code that does something like probabilistic record linkage to connect 2 different data sets. Well, that doesn't really belong, like, in your R Markdown file. And so we've done a couple of projects where like all of that sort of backend stuff is done. And then you finally sort of get to a point where, like, maybe the code to develop your model is in something like an R Markdown file at the very end of the project, but it just reads in all those other dependencies. And then, you end up with like the PDF file of the paper or the HTML document in the final export folder for the project, for example.
Nice. I think Nick and then Chanel. Nick?
Yeah, sounds like they're related questions, actually. This is great. I'm a big make user, though. The whole tabs and spaces thing seems to put people off a bit. I've just told a story about them in the chat. I'm sure you cater for this, but I always think about intermediates as well as inputs and outputs. I realized you could treat those as separate stages in principle, but not necessarily, because it doesn't always work like that. What's the story there? Presumably you can either have another directory or...
Yeah, so I get, if I'm understanding the question correctly, there's kind of two responses to that. So for me, which is appropriate depends on like what's the end use or what's the next use of that intermediate file. So if you're producing some sort of intermediate data set that like lives between tasks, then PDPP will handle the process of symlinking the output directory of one task to the input directory of another one. So if it's intermediate in the sense that it just sort of, is read in by one file after being produced by another one, then PDP naturally.
I really mean within what's conceptually a single task, you generate intermediate files that no one else needs. Maybe they get thrown away at the end or whatever, but you still have to do something.
Right, I see. Yeah, so within a task, you can, so it's consistent with PDPP to put that stuff in output, but then just not symlink them to downstream tasks. Okay. But there's also a convention, which I didn't mention, which happens quite a lot, and we do it in my lab too, which is that you can add, so PDPP won't do this itself because we don't want to encourage too many people to do it, but you can create other directories. By convention, we often create a directory called hand inside a task, and that's mostly just for doing kind of exploratory stuff that might produce a bunch of things as you're figuring out, designing some task or something. And similarly, those would not get propagated throughout the project.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Janelle? I can ask the question for you. So Janelle asks, how well does the system handle wildcards for intermediate inputs, i.e. dynamically named or variable number of inputs generated in a previous step?
Yeah, so right now, we don't have any functionality that is deliberately built in to handle wildcards. I'm thinking about this, and I don't see any reason why it would fail or throw errors, but I haven't tested it. And like I said, we haven't designed for it specifically. But when you create a new task, for example, and you say, okay, well, the dependencies are going to come from whichever other tasks there. On the command line, like the tool is going to pop up lists, and you can just cycle through that list and very rapidly select it by hitting a space bar. So it's not like, you're manually like typing out all the file names and paths and everything. Like it's extremely snappy and fast. So I think it could work if you were to tell PDPP, for example, like programmatically, I want you to just pull in anything with like a CSV extension. But the way that it's designed right now is to populate these lists that you select from in order to link up all of the dependencies.
Well, I might just say thank you once again to John very much for your presentation. Absolutely wonderful, and hopefully next year we can do this. We can do this in person.
I hope so.